Welcome to this conversation. So this is hosted by Cris Worley Fine Arts in partnership with Culture Place, which, if you don't know what it is yet, it's a digital marketplace for contemporary art and to connect galleries with patrons and artists with patrons. And that was actually founded quite recently by the Dallas Art Fair. I'm Brandon Zech, and I'm sure many of you know the artist that I'm talking to today, Celia Eberle. Celia is represented by Cris Worley Fine Arts in Dallas, and you can see more of Celia's work and more work from Cris Worley's gallery, and also work from a ton of different other Texas galleries on Culture Place's website. With that out of the way, thank you all for attending this talk today in our new Zoom world. Before we get started, also, I want to point out there's a question and answer function along like the bottom of your screen. Celia and I are going to kind of keep that up and keep an eye on it as we go through this talk. So if you have any ideas, thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to drop them in there and we'll address them either at the end or throughout our conversation, or, we'll make it work. We want to be as kind of participatory as possible since we're actually all divided from each other. With that, Celia, I was trying to think how I would start a conversation between us about your work. And like right before we got on this call, we were talking about how your work is so, how it's so varied, and how when you had a big, I guess what you would call a retrospective in 2014 at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas in Beaumont, you kind of, even you had a hard time coming up with some sort of like overarching narrative around your work. And I think the best way to kind of step into the world of your work is to understand where your work is like really coming from. And I feel like a lot of that is, it's inspired by places that have been like an important part of your life. Like you grew up in East Texas, you talk about in a lot of conversations and just in what you and I have talked about, you talk about seeing the Black Forest for the first time and how that really had a large impact on you. I've heard you also talk about like visiting the Met cloisters and how that's kind of impacted the religious part of your work. I was wondering if you could just kind of take me through how the places that you've been, a lot of them, like East Texas was a part of your life for, well, a fair amount of time. Yeah. Yes. And when I look at your work, after I learned all of this about you, I kind of started to understand it better, and I started to see qualities of all of those places kind of merging and coming together in your work. So I was wondering if you could talk about how kind of the places that you've either visited that have made a big impact on you, or like the places like East Texas that you lived for so much of your life have kind of come into all that you're doing.
Well, I feel like I can't help but be shaped by East Texas because my dad was born there, and so I lived there most of my life and went to school there, and so it's got its own vibe, which is pretty dark. It's very Southern Gothic. Mm-hmm. I was recently talking to a writer who is from there, and he said he always describes it as being very Southern Gothic. And I said, oh yes, that's exactly what I always say too. So it's material to work with, and it's a very religious place. So, my interest in the Bible started there because I had a lot of questions that were not answered, and I had to find the answers for myself. And we were also Presbyterian, and Presbyterians do, it's that Protestant questioning that is traditional to that kind of faith. So mm-hmm. I think that was important for me to set me off on the path of questioning things. But I think even before that, even as a very young child, I had a lot of existential questions. And getting to travel was really important. I mean, I used my Dallas travel grant to visit the porcelain centers of Europe because I was working with my paper mache faux porcelains at the time. I was doing these giant, oversized, clumsy reproductions of traditional kind of porcelain things, and working with the fact that so much porcelain just repeats the same imagery over and over again, and thinking how that sort of mirrors the qualities of history, of how history becomes distorted over time, and how we forget or misinterpret or totally reinterpret things. So conceptually, I thought that was a very strong body of work, but I also discovered that there was another artist who was doing almost exactly the same thing. Even though her rationale was different, I just felt like I couldn't keep doing it for that reason. And because she was getting recognition too.
I don't want to interrupt you about this, but one of the things that I really love about hearing you talk about your work is that you point out all of the instances where that happens. I feel like a lot of artists, I mean, I've seen it in a lot of artists' work where they find out much later that someone is like doing the same thing that they're doing. And, you know, I've seen artists deal with it in a ton of different ways. Like sometimes they ignore it. Sometimes they just kind of push it under the rug. Sometimes they try and like make the distinction of like, well, it's not actually the same. And I've seen in multiple instances where you've just been like, we were doing exactly the same thing.
It's true.
I kind of love that, but I feel like it also, that speaks to just the ethos of what the ethos of what you're addressing about history and just how kind of nothing is new. Like it fits in with what you're doing in your ideology of just being able or having the ability and kind of the self-awareness to be able to address that. So I always find that interesting when I hear you talk about it.
I appreciate your insight into that very much. Truth. I'm interested in what's true and trying to express what's true. And if I'm not honest about, you know, what I'm doing and where it comes from and the faults within it, then I can't be on that path. So it's very important. It's very important to acknowledge when I suddenly realized that, oh my gosh, this is so much like so-and-so, and I didn't even know that, or maybe I knew it and didn't realize it, and that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Not to me, but to other people as well.
Was that trip where you also went to the porcelain centers, did you see the Black Forest then too? And is that kind of what kicked off the animism component to your work?
Yes, that was really so interesting to me to see that huge, overpowering, natural being. I mean, it was like a being, and I could see where all those Black Forest fairy tales came from. I mean, nature could turn on you in an instant there. You could be out there and it could be nice weather, but then suddenly you might get trapped in a terrible blizzard or something if you weren't, you know, really aware of your surroundings. Or, of course, they didn't have weather forecasting back then. So, I mean, people were always in danger in the forest. So, but they had to be in there because that's, you know, they had to forage, and a lot of, you know, very poor people, marginalized people lived in the forest. Some of them actually lived in trees and things like that. And so, and the idea that a child might wander off and be eaten was not, you know, that extreme of an idea because there was a lot of desperation during that time frame when all of these stories had their sort of original origins.
Yeah.
So, so that struck me as being a very interesting part of human history and the human development. So I wanted to explore that, and I still use that idea of being on the verge of returning to a state where we are absolutely at the mercy of nature. And I think we are certainly experiencing that right now.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to the trip that you made to the porcelain centers and to those pieces specifically. I'm going to share with y'all real quick. Y'all should see we have just a few images to kind of accompany the talk. These are two of your fake porcelain pieces. The one on the left, the woman, is in the collection of the DMA, and the one on the right was shown at Central Track back in kind of the early 2010s. But these are paper mache pieces, and the whole kind of idea around them is how you can lose history and how things can be reproduced over time. And I've heard you talk about like the molds that these porcelain figures were made in, and how, you know, over time, if you continue to use those same molds, they lose details or things are kind of added back in or they're changed, and how this idea of these objects over time kind of track how we perceive history. And one of the things that I kind of started noticing is that in some of your more recent work, you yourself have kind of used a little bit of this way of creating. So if you'll bear with me, I'm gonna scroll up. So I feel like a lot of your early work, like the late 90s, early 2000s, it was kind of these maybe more, this is the wrong word, but these more unique objects. Whereas now I see you doing a lot of things in series. They're all unique objects, they're all handmade, but things like this piece with all of the birds chasing the one bird holding a ruby, like a bauble. Pieces like this, which are all, you know, they're all handmade ceramic pieces by you, but they kind of are all following, it's almost like this parent-child relationship. Pieces like your bats, which are one of my favorites, but also like these were made, correct me if I'm wrong, by packing clay into molds, kind of almost paralleling, you know, not quite paralleling the way these porcelain figurines that you were commenting on was made, but making them in a very similar way. And I was wondering if you've kind of consciously thought about this way of critiquing these objects that were made this way and kind of making one-offs of them to now becoming a part of that history, but doing it in different ways. Does that make sense?
Yes, I know. It's complex. It's a complex relationship between these actual ceramic items and the paper mache, which was a critique of porcelain and a critique of history. Whereas these terracotta things are more related to nature, and they don't specifically address that relationship with how porcelain is made and how these terracotta things were made, because I'm more interested in the sort of natural process that brings about the terracotta figure. I'm interested in how that plays into the meaning of the piece. Mm-hmm. It's a natural, and it is a very old and primitive process. The porcelain things are more complicated to make, and are more refined. I mean, actual porcelain things mm-hmm. are a more refined approach to making things out of ceramic, and the history of porcelain itself is very, very interesting, because it was such a highly prized thing that the Chinese invented the method, and the Europeans coveted the Chinese imports and desperately wanted to learn the secret. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese managed to keep it a secret for hundreds of years. And finally, it was figured out by some very unfortunate man who was imprisoned by King Augustus the Strong in Dresden. He was imprisoned by him because he had claimed that he could make gold. And of course, he never did manage to make gold, but he said, oh, look here, I've made porcelain. And so then he was kept for the rest of his life making and refining the porcelain process. So that's very interesting, but it doesn't directly bear on, you know, the terracotta things I'm making.
Well, yeah, I could see it also as a way, like specifically with the bats, which are, I mean, which from a distance, I mean, they look like bats, and they look like bats from up close also, but you start to see the intricacies a lot more, like in their, just in the ways that they're formed, and you start to see also the different molds. I kind of see the replication aspect of it, or the easily, you know, using the molds to reproduce them as a little bit of a means to an end, to be able to have an installation like this, and to be able to kind of have it on the scale that you want to. Because another of the things that I really like about your work, and one of the things that I think makes it really powerful, and this is a lot of your more recent work specifically, is that it's on a scale that makes sense for what it is. Like, I'm always of the belief that the medium that you use to create your work, and kind of the inherently materialistic ideas around it, medium, size, they communicate 80%, 90% of what you're actually going for. And the kind of the last little 10% is where it gets hard, and where technique comes in around that medium, and where the real, I guess you could call it the hand, where the hand of the artist comes in. But I think one of the things that you do really well is using those materialistic choices to your extreme advantage. Like, you've kind of progressed a lot, and recently it's been a lot of stone, bone, kind of precious or semi-precious gems. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your choices, and kind of the reason with the reason that you choose to make certain work out of what you choose to make it, right? You're not carving stuffed teddy, excuse me, you're not carving stuffed teddy bears out of alabaster. You're carving an elephant that has an umbilical cord attached to it out of alabaster. There's a reason that you're using the certain things.
Right.
You. And it's a lot of times these natural materials also, they're going back and recreating nature in a different way, specifically, is what I'm seeing, at least.
Yeah, I like your take on it, and I appreciate your insight. Yes, the materials are very important to the message, and after I abandoned the paper mache, I mean, I had been using what I considered really humble materials for a long time, and it made me think about stone. Like, well, why don't I try something more precious and in its own way cheesy? Because, you know, there's all this association with stone as being passé, and it's for artists who aren't really mainstream and things of that nature. Of course, that's changing now because they have, you know, developed ways of computer assisted carving of stone. So you're seeing a lot more of it now than you did for a while. And there are artists who have, you know, managed to have their own singular voice with stone that resonates with contemporary art, but it's very rare. And so I thought, well, here's another thing that I can do that isn't contemporary, but I'll make it that way. So, yeah, and it's a natural thing, and I'm turning part of a mountain into dust. So it's and I actually even mentioned that to the guy that I purchase stone from. I said, it kind of makes me feel bad. We're cutting up a mountain to get this stuff. And he said, oh, but we have thousands of years to go before we cut down that mountain. Well, that's make me feeling better.
I kind of like that in that way your work is almost a critique of itself. I mean, that's very meta, but like it's kind of true. Like the work that you're making has a lot to do with, a lot of this meaning is hidden a little bit below the craft, and you have to spend some time with it to get it. But your work is about like environmental disaster and how humans are having an impact on the planet and how humans are destroying it, and your work is made out of the materials that are mined because of that.
That's right.
It's, again, self-aware. Well, and also it's just your work, it has this, it threads this needle of being really humorous and playful to me while also being super macabre. Like I'm going to share, there's pieces, a lot of your pieces are carved out of bone, or a lot of more recent pieces are, and there have been anything from birds to wasp nests to moths, butterflies, like there's this insanely, well, humorous and macabre aspect of taking a bone of, what are those cow
Yeah.
bones?
Yeah.
Taking a cow bone and turning it into an insect, or turning it into another animal.
Oh yeah, Frankensteinish kind of. I hadn't really thought about that particularly, but yeah, it is. It's true. Yeah.
Well, in relation to you're talking about destroying mountains to create work. There was a piece that I found when I was looking kind of through everything that you've done that I didn't know of, or actually there were a couple pieces, and they kind of made me start to think about how performative your work is. Some of these earlier pieces, there's a piece I'm talking about specifically from 2001 called Mine, that was at Plush Gallery, in a show you had at Plush Gallery. And it was this big mound of, sand?
Yes.
So it was this big mound of sand, and you hid coral and precious and semi-precious stones inside of it, and you invited people to come and destroy this mound. And mine, of course, being a play on mining, and also mine, like what I'm finding are mine because people got to keep them.
Yes.
So this top image is from a video you can find it on YouTube if you just search Celia Eberle, but it's a video of people mining the work. And then the bottom images on the left, it's pre-destruction, and on the right, it is post-destruction. And that piece kind of coupled with this other piece that's from 2001 at Cynthia Mulcahy's gallery, where this was a piece that it was in the show, it was at the center of the gallery, but also during the opening, someone was walking around in this huge hand costume. I hadn't necessarily thought of your work as like explicitly performative, although there's a lot that's kind of expected, I feel like, of your viewers, but you allow people to engage on kind of whatever level they see fit. Like, people can appreciate your objects as beautiful, well-made objects, or they can kind of get into what the nitty-gritty of why you're creating them. So there's kind of a range that people can actually engage with. But with these kind of two pieces, the hand costume and mine in mind, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about a concept that you've been working on for a little bit, that is very performative, that may or may not be able to happen in its way you originally intended, but you were working on like a dance party. that included like a lot of other elements and accoutrements. It's almost kind of like a dance party with your own decorations.
That's it. It's a dance party with my own decorations. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to actually recreate the paw for that. It was going to be slightly different looking, but it would still essentially be the paw. Yeah, I intended it to be an end of times dance party, and I was going to call it Waiting for Robot, because I thought that artificial intelligence would be a real danger to, you know, the future of humanity. And I was concerned that it would gradually replace people in the workplace, and how are we going to manage that, or are we going to manage that? What sort of chaos are we unleashing? We always jump in with our new ideas and never think about the consequences. And there are many unforeseeable consequences that occur way, way into the future with anything that we create. So I just wanted to tackle that idea and my concerns surrounding it. And now it seems that a different catastrophe has hit us, and it may hasten the artificial intelligence, or we may return to a sort of dark ages situation where human labor is so much cheaper and so much more available that it's better to, or easier to hire a human than pay for a robot. I kind of doubt that, because I think that flesh and blood is always going to be too costly for these employers. It's a complicated situation, a complicated scenario. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And I don't know if the end of times dance party will have any validity once this is over, because we're actually living the end of times at this moment.
End of times. Yeah.
So, you know, I'm gonna have to think about all of that very differently, probably. But yes, audience engagement is important to me, and you know, here again, I'm working with the idea that we're controlled by our appetites, and that's what the pause is about. It's about the grasp, the sort of, I want it, I'm going to get it, I'm going to take it. So I'll continue to work with these same sort of basic themes. The idea that civilization is a thin veneer, and that we have to do what we feel rather than what we know.
Well, with that, you know, one of the things that I feel like is always a conversation around art is how much can art really change the world? Or what impact can art actually have, especially with, you know, with social practice art being more of kind of a practiced form nowadays, and with kind of people's expectations that if you make an artwork about something, it's going to start a dialogue, change people's perception, yada, yada. I wanted to know where you kind of fall on that spectrum, because I mean, the work, one of the reasons I ask is that, again, before you and I were talking, before you and I got on this conversation, we were talking about your show at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas. And this show, which here are some install shots of it, it was because you kind of you would have had a hard time piecing together a larger grand scheme narrative around your work. It ended up as a lot of your works just pushed kind of off center to the middle of this gallery. It's very much like a child's room, like here's my stuff, or like a yard sale. And I don't have a picture of it, but off to the side, you just included like two matches that were made of, would you remind me what they were made of?
Bone and ruby matches.
So two like almost looking hyper realistic matches that's basically like just set this stuff on fire, because those were the only things that were apart from this pile of stuff. And that's, again, talking about kind of how self-conscious you are. Like, this is a way that I almost feel like I can read that you're like, this art, this is kind of what it is, and it's in this museum, and it's in the middle of this space. But if you don't see what's going on here, it's not going to really impact what you believe or change any views. How do you, am I right in perceiving that, or do you feel some other way?
No, you're right. I'm not sure I believe that art can change things. I'm not really sure. I mean, my hope is to create an experience that will be memorable enough that will cause someone to think about it and have some impact in that way. And I'm not saying there have never been any artworks that changed things. I'm sure there were artworks. And we still look at David and Ang, and they were essentially political artists, and mm-hmm. and their work was striking and useful at the time for the politician Napoleon. Yeah, and there are things that we always point to, like Van Gogh, that people find moving and challenging and delightful. And of course, part of it is the artist's backstory as well in that instance. So it is possible, I think, for art to have some impact, but it's just part of a collective thing. It's part of a collective experience. It's a reflection on the experience of the time. And in that way, it can be useful, I mean, historically, but I'm not sure if it changes hearts and minds to any degree in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, this is probably going to be my final question for you. While we're talking, I want to encourage anyone, if you have a question that we haven't discussed or something in Celia's work that you really like, that you'd like to know more about, please do drop it in the Q&A. And we can have a second to get to it. But with that idea of work tracking history, but maybe not completely changing it, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, like, I'm trying to think of the right way to ask this question. If you could talk about how your materials and the imagery in your work has kind of paralleled the like inherent content of it. So like an example of what I'm talking about is in the early 2000s and even kind of into like 2010, in work that you made in like oil pastel or in pastel or embroidery, you seem to kind of be creating these characters, and they may be like kind of influenced by like the Black Forest Grimm nursery rhymes, or they could have, been a little more, but they were kind of distinctly your characters, it feels like, when looking back at them, as opposed to like the work that you're making now is so much more like the bats they're your bats, but at the same time they're bats. You know what I mean? Yes. They're not of your own, they're not sprung from your mind in the same way that some of these other kind of earlier characters are. Like a good example is from this Art Museum of Southeast Texas installation. In like the lower right photo, there's this, behind this bear that's behind this quilted bear, there's this like cat-like person wearing, like, it almost looks like wearing a skin suit. Or in the photo on the upper left, there's kind of this weird animal-ish character, but it's not quite an animal. Like, how did those characters kind of come in and out as opposed to what you're doing now? Is it personal growth? Is it what you're hoping to get across? Is it a combination of stuff?
I'd say it's a combination of personal growth and what I'm trying to convey. Uh, the animal characters that I first started doing in oil pastel, um, I started doing those when I was at 500X.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I first got to 500X, I was just so elated. I was like, oh, these Dallas artists accept me and my work fits in. And then I was like, oh, but my work looks like what they're doing. I need to come up with something that's more uniquely mine. And so I started trying to examine, my own background more and thinking about what things influenced me. And so I had always been in love with fairy tales, and I loved my little golden books, which, if you look at those, you realize that they are heavily influenced by Persian miniatures. And they're very colorful little vignettes, every illustration, even across the number of illustrators that they had. They're all very colorful and sort of enclosed almost, like each image tells a portion of the story. So I wanted to sort of explore that idea of, a really colorful image that tells a sort of dire story about human circumstance and how we didn't recognize all the time what forces were acting within and without us.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the beginning of this whole thought process, was those oil pastels. And I call them fables. And so then I started just expanding and expanding on my concept of mythology, and I just kept expanding it. And so now I'm to the point where I think practically anything that isn't hard science or math is mythology. So, because even when we consider it to be history, even if we think it's concrete, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's the trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Talking a little more about nature, we have a question about your bone wasp nest pieces. Can you talk a little about like your motivation for creating those and also the process by which you make them? Because if I don't have a photo of them on hand, but you can see them on Cris Worley's website. You can see them on Celia's website. But if you've never seen these, the first time I saw one in a gallery, I didn't quite know what I was looking at, and definitely not how it was made, like without having a sheet or something in front of me. And just the encounter with it is it's such an interesting object. Could you talk a little bit about the process of it?
Sure. Well, the first wasp nest I made was a really huge nest that hung from the ceiling, and it had wasps on it. And I was thinking about chaos theory and how that might act as an explanation for the concept of God. So the first nest I called the mind of God, because the wasps take the chaotic materials from nature that they build the nest with, and they create this order and these beautiful orderly geometric cells. And I thought that just paralleled the idea of chaos theory, that the chaos theory, not the butterfly flaps that swings, but the chaos theory that says whatever is chaotic evolves to an order, or else it just appears chaotic but is actually part of a larger order. So that's what I was thinking about, and how the human mind perceives order. I mean, I know a little more about this now than I did at the time, that it's just natural for the human mind to seek and perceive order. And
Well, we want to understand things, right? That's kind of
we
our,
want to understand.
yeah.
That's how we understand things. And I think it's just natural to conceive of a larger mind and a larger hand making this order for us or against us. And so that's why the wasp nest is for me a very potent sort of symbol. And making them out of bone seemed to be even more of an interesting mental exercise, as well as a challenge, because I have to piece these large ends of bone together in order to get a sizable enough working surface to produce the cells. So what I do is glue these bone shapes together and fill them in with other little bits of bone, and then I start carving the cells into the bone. I also made an alabaster version back in the early 2000s as well.
I didn't know that. I haven't ever seen that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an image. There's probably no image online of that piece because I'm pretty sure it was just a slide that I had at the time. But yeah, so I have repeated the wasp nest. I've explored it a number of times.
Well, and it's just always different because the way that you piece those bones together is always different. And it's always different because in nature, wasp nests are inherently different.
They are.
I've seen photos of your studio. I know you have wasp nests around. Are you kind of making a certain wasp nest or a certain portion of it, or is it just kind of felt out and those are around for like reference to look at how like the holes, the openings are shaped? And
Right. No, they're just for reference. Yeah, I am sort of constrained by the material. I mean, it has its way. I say that about stone too. I mean, it has its way with you. You may set out to make a particular thing, but it may not necessarily look the way you want it to.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, which I think the concept about your how you think about the wasp nest fits in well. What are your reading habits like? Like, what media do you consume? Do you consume a lot of written material? Are you a fiction person, a news person? I know you follow what's going on, which is why your work responds the way it does. But what are kind of your habits around that?
Yeah, I do watch a lot of news, probably too much news. And then whatever idea seems, important to me at the time, I will gather together all kinds of material about it. I'll read about it. If it's something that I can find books that have a lot of imagery associated with that particular concept or time frame, then I'll go and find those books and I'll pore over them and just let it sort of stew in my head for a while, and then things rise to the surface. I always think of my mind as being sort of like that toy, the 8-ball, where you shake it up and then you wait for an answer to kind of swim to the surface. And it takes a while, like you're really impatient, like, where's that answer?
That's, I can see that because I feel like there's also, I mean, in a lot of ways that I see other artists, and I think you included hearing that consume, it's like there's a little bit of a time delay because, I mean, creating a piece of art, and especially the way that you're creating, that takes oftentimes a long time and a lot of kind of thought out work, and not to mention the material, like how you're talking about, if you get a piece of stone, you want to be able to kind of know what you're going to do with it at least, or at least have that concept. So I could see you kind of processing it for quite a little while and churning it before it rises to the top.
Yeah, sometimes years.
I think we have one last question here, and I love this question because what you do is so varied, and something we didn't even mention is you're working in, because of the robot dance party, you're working in animatronics now. So you've kind of run the gambit of old materials, new materials, wood, coral, gemstones, etc. What's the most challenging media that you've chosen to work with, and what's the most difficult to obtain? So two different questions in that.
The most difficult to obtain? I don't know, really. I'd have to think about that one for a long time because nothing comes to mind right now. If I can't find exactly what I want, I usually find something else that will work.
Has there been an instance where you've wanted to like create a piece and you can't find the right size of stone or of material, or like the right grain of marble or anything like that? Or do you just have a really good stone guy?
I have a really good stone guy, but what are the challenges? Well, I do. It's true. He's a very talented person and very insightful, and he knows a lot.
Yeah.
But
what about the most challenging material, or maybe the most challenging material that you've worked in physically, and also just the one that's been hardest to learn?
They're challenging in different ways. I mean, any of the carving is very physically challenging. I mean, it requires a lot of strength and energy to do the carving, no matter what material I'm working in. And the stone is particularly difficult because it requires a pneumatic chisel to start with to get your rough shape if you want to do it with any kind of speed. So that's very hard on you to use that vibrating tool. So there's a physical effort, and then there's the mental effort. Like I think that animatronics are very mentally challenging because I don't have a real deep skills in that area, and I'm not really interested in developing deep skills in that area. I don't want to start making breadboards or anything like that. I just want to make these sort of limited gestures, I guess. I want the things to make these sort of limited gestures, and so that takes a lot.
Yeah, you need the thing to do what you want the thing to do, and that's
right.
That's it.
Yes. That's it. That's all I'm going to do with it, and that's generally my approach to everything. Is I'm not trying to become the best stone carver in the world. I'm just trying to do it well enough to convey what I want to convey. I don't expect to become Michelangelo by any means. There's no need to. We've already had a Michelangelo. But so yeah, those are tough questions to answer.
Mm-hmm. I think we're wrapping up. I'll leave everyone with this image, which is one of the animatronics. It's the mouth opening and closing. I don't have the video up, but this is what's, is it right to say this is what's coming down the pike or something like this?
Yeah. Yes, this is what's coming down the pike. Yes, I'm working on trying to create these things that have some motion, and they won't all be fur. But yeah, for me, fur is it's about the sort of animistic aspects of ourselves, and the idea that civilization is a thin veneer, and things like that.
I think that's a good place to end it. This was great, Celia. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to. Thanks.
I really appreciate it.
If anyone out there wants to see more of what I do, you can visit glasstire.com. I'm the publisher of Glasstire. If you want to see more of Celia's work, you can see it on Cris Worley's site on Culture Place, or on Cris Worley's website or Celia's website. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. Okay.